Shalom Aleichem and good evening. I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle. Welcome to Beyond the Almost Promised Land, a two-part program exploring Hasia Diner's seminal work of scholarship on Jewish involvement in the early civil rights movement in the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks from 1915 to 1935. The Workers' Circle is a Jewish social justice organization that builds progressive Jewish identity through Jewish cultural engagement, the promotion of Yiddish language and traditions, and multi-generational education, all with the goal of inspiring collective activism and impactful activism. We know that we have a particular responsibility to understand and work against racism as part of our work learning and engaging around the Yiddish culture, which forms such a crucial part of our heritage and values. This program is one part of our commitment to fighting racism. We also take action to advance racial equity through ongoing activism on voting rights, immigrant rights, and worker rights. We are thrilled to have 13 co-sponsors of this two-part program. We're highlighting all of them now in the chat, and I hope you all take a look. We value this opportunity to work as partners to fight racism and create a Shenra and Besser Welt für alle, a better and more beautiful world for all. Tonight and next week, Yiddish performer Anthony Mordechai Tzvi Russell will be interviewing Professor Hasia Diner, the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at NYU and a board member of the Workers' Circle. Please note that tonight we will not be taking questions from the audience. Rather, Anthony will stand in for us as the reader of the book and interlocutor with Hasia. This magisterial book raises profound questions and tells a nuanced history of Black and Jewish relations. Anthony will be posing questions as a Jew and as a Black man, as someone who holds both identities, and he brings his own experience of being Black in America to a book that is about American Jewish interaction with Black experience. I am truly honored to introduce Hasia Diner. Hasia is the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University, with joint appointment in the Department of History and the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. She is also director of the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History. She is the author of We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, winner of the National Jewish Book Award and the American Jewish Historical Society's Saul Wiener Prize, and Roads Taken, the Great Jewish Migration to the New World and the Peddlers Who Led the Way, a global history of Jewish peddling and Jewish migrations. She is a co-editor of 1929, Mapping the Jewish World, winner of a National Jewish Book Award for anthologies. A Guggenheim Fellow, Hasia has also written about other immigrant groups and the contours of their migration and settlement, including a study of Irish immigrant women and of Irish, Italian, and East European Jewish foodways. She is an elected member of both the Society of American Historians and the American Academy of Jewish Research, and lectures widely to scholarly and community audiences on a range of topics. I am also so pleased as well to introduce Anthony Mordechai Tzvi Russell, a vocalist, composer, and arranger specializing in music in the Yiddish language. His work in traditional Ashkenazi Jewish musical forms led to a musical exploration of his own ethnic roots through the research, arrangement, and performance of 100 years of African-American roots music, resulting in the EP Convergence, a collaboration with klezmer consort Varetsky Pass. Anthony also performs in a duo, Tzvei Brider, two brothers, with accordionist and pianist Dimitri Gaskin, composing and performing their original music set to modernist Yiddish poetry of the 20th century. An essayist in a number of publications, including Jewish Currents and Moments magazine, I am delighted to add that Anthony has been consulting with the Workers' Circle around racial justice and Yiddishkeit since the fall of 2020. Anthony lives in Massachusetts with his husband of 5 years, Rabbi Michael Rothbaum. Welcome, Hasia and Anthony. And Anthony, now I turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne. In May 2020, I was invited by the Jewish Telegraphic Agency to contribute to a collection of responses from Black Jews in the face of protest after the murder of George Floyd. In my contribution, I wrote the following, quote, "Let's get real here, American Jews. You are living in an old country, whether you choose to recognize it or not. The state-sanctioned violence visited upon Black communities happens in ghettos you can easily pronounce, in towns you visit without the aid of a tour guide, and cities you reside in without a granted law of return. Solidarity with Black people doesn't require a radical act of historical imagination. You are here. We are here. You know what to do. Do it. Now." End quote. When this was published, there were a number of responses to me personally, and one that I think unsettled me the most was the response to my declaration that American Jews knew what to do. The response was, no, actually, we don't know what to do. What are we supposed to do? I think my frustration with this response stemmed from the prospect of having to be both the potential victim and the source of the solution for this uniquely American problem. As I'd written, figuring out what to do shouldn't require a radical act of historical imagination, because a history of what we can do is there. And one of the most comprehensive explorations of that history is Hasia Diner's book, In the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 through 1935. It's my honor to be in discussion with the author of that book in a two-part interview. Tonight's interview will be a look at the development of the book, and the second interview, exactly a week from tonight, will be about the book itself, its exploration of 2 decades of Jewish advocacy on behalf of a Black community beleaguered by structural, systemic, and violent racism, the cultural and societal motivations behind that advocacy, and the implications of that history for us today, as we continue to figure out the question that was posed to me: what are we supposed to do? Hasia Diner, thank you so much for joining with me this evening. There you are.
Okay, I'm glad I figured out that. I guess I didn't figure out the technology. Somebody helped me. Really, it's such a pleasure to be here, such an honor. And I think one of the nicest things about this two-part series is getting to know you, if only by Zoom.
Likewise.
I look forward to the days when we will meet in person.
Maybe soon and in our days, as I believe the saying usually goes. So I wanted to ask you, in the very first pages of your book is a dedication to your mother and the memory of your father. Having built your scholarly career around the study of American Jewish history, including immigration to the United States and the history of ethnicity in America, I was curious how your interest in these areas started and whether they interacted with or were informed by your family or personal history.
So that is really an amazing way to start this conversation, and really very powerful for me as a kind of journey back to a long time ago in my life. So remember, this was the book of my youth. This is my doctoral dissertation and then first book. And so much has happened since. But yes, I mean, this was, as much as historians like to say we study problems because they have analytic significance, this project spoke to me in a very deep way. I think most powerfully, it was first the impact of my father, who at very young age exposed me and my sister to issues of racism in America without necessarily using that word. And where the opportunities came up, he explored with us the reality that in American life, Black people, I guess obviously that was not the word he would have used in the 1950s, Negroes, were profoundly handicapped and persecuted and treated with utter brutality. And this was very much set against, it was something that really moved me. And it was something I carried into my teenage years as an activist in my own very tiny little way in high school civil rights work. But this was contrasted with another family story, in as much as my larger family, that is the aunts and uncles and cousins, never hesitated to articulate what we would say were just utterly racist remarks. And the word Schwarze just permeated the air. And when my father, who was really the political, intellectual, ethical anchor of my life, would argue with them. And they'd say, he'd say, don't you know people say that about Jews too? Their answer was always, Moshe, you don't know these people, they're animals. And it was sort of that kind of juxtaposition between hearing, and not just from them, but in other quarters of the very Jewish world in which I inhabited, words and that were so unmitigatedly racist, and the message from from home and from him, which was you and we have an obligation to not be like other Americans. And so it was, on the one hand, I could say the clash between these two, but they were never a clash, because there was one that was right and there was one that was formative. And the other was that which I railed against, and which made me realize how much hatred there was in the world. And however much I liked these people as my relatives, I could never forget that they would say these things in the most casual but pervasive way. And when I came to this topic, it was very much in my mind trying to understand the context from which the positive messages I heard, the messages of responsibility and humanism, that were the ones that were really formative. Again, the others were just the opposite, the negative. But I understood that those words were out there, and they were out there within the Jewish world.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about the issue of racism from a personal stance, because the way in which you treat it in the book is almost solely from an institutional responses to racism. So it's interesting to know that your experiences of that on a personal level are behind these very kind of historic and large and institutional responses to the phenomenon of racism, and how it was counteracted by members of the Jewish community. I thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, so I think the word behind is really important. That is, I to this day really take the position that as a scholar, when I sit down to write and when I sit down to try to come to terms with the material I've found, it's not about me. Okay, I want to understand my subjects. I want to understand the world in which they functioned and why they saw the world the way they did. So I do try to remove myself, but it always creeps in.
Understandably so. An important part of your work is the exploration of the history behind narratives the American Jewish community has created and disseminated about the challenges and processes Jewish immigrants encountered in establishing themselves in the United States. In what ways do you think have the findings of your work differed from widely accepted communal narratives about American Jews?
Right. So I think that for the most part, when this story is told in one iteration or another, it's told as something that was a natural affinity, Well, naturally, Jews felt that way. Naturally, Jews stepped forward. Naturally, as people who themselves had suffered, they felt an empathy for others who were suffering in the present. And likewise, I think in much of the narrative about this, scholars, analysts, just commentators will refer to what they understand to be the Jewish tradition. Okay, the Jewish tradition says that, to look out for the stranger and so on, responsibility towards others. And certainly many of my subjects said the same thing. That is, back in the 19 teens and 20s and 30s, they said, well, naturally we take this position. But what was really striking to me, and what was my takeaway, and where I saw my book really differing from much of that communal narrative, whether embedded in scholarship or not, is that I understood they had a stake in this, that it was something that they did not to out of pure altruistic motives, because I don't necessarily believe that that exists as a sort of historical construct, but rather it served them and it helped them further a number of projects that they were engaged in. And one of the moments in my research where this really hit me was when in the 1913, 1914, there was a very intense correspondence between Louis Marshall, who was the president of the American Jewish Committee, served the NAACP on its legal defense team, did a number of court cases for the NAACP, and Julius Rosenwald, who later on I wrote a book about, who is a philanthropist who invested a tremendous amount of money in African-American education. And so there's a correspondence between them on the issue of Leo Frank, this Jewish young man, businessman in Georgia, who had been arrested for what were clearly trumped up charges. And Rosenwald wrote to Marshall and said, don't you think we should be talking about this as anti-Semitism? Shouldn't we be conducting a great campaign against the anti-Semitism in Georgia, which has framed Leo Frank? And Marshall wrote back to him and said, no, we should defend Leo Frank, but not as a Jew, but as somebody who's up on trumped up charges. And if we talk about anti-Semitism too much, we are going to, in a sense, inspire it on those who don't necessarily yet act and feel as anti-Semites. So it was kind of tamp down this conversation about anti-Semitism. But in the next breath, it's passionate writing and speeches about the condition of African Americans and the need to do something. And so about that, they were very willing to talk in intense and passionate terms. But when it came to dealing with anti-Semitism, really very confused and complex set of reactions. So clearly there was something going on there. And I entitled this, or I thought of this as something as a kind of vicarious attack. They're attacking American society, but not in their own name. They're attacking American society through the image and the reality of America's greatest victims. So I think there were a number of other important ways in which standing up for Black people, contributing money, writing, lecturing, participating in civil rights and other kinds of activities was good, but it was also good for them. Okay, and that they had, and not in any kind of crass or kind of self-serving way. It was a strategy about enhancing their own status and solidifying their integration into American life. Okay, but through this cause or through this reality that allowed them to say, we're different. We're not like other Americans, just as my father had said. we have something distinctive. And that too is part of their strategy. We are like Americans, but we're not.
It's interesting because so much about the phenomenon of Jews coming from Eastern Europe and arriving on the shores of the United States is depicted and expressed in terms of survival. And yet, when it comes to an eventual turn to beginning to advocate on behalf of other American citizens, it's not considered in terms of survival, or it's not considered as something, but it's considered as something that's purely altruistic, something that is sort of in the ethical toolbox of Jews who arrived to the United States. So it's interesting to see that sort of image complicated.
Yeah, complicated. And they really had a stake in the creation of a new kind of America, a kind of America where individuals were had access to resources and rights and opportunity as individuals, and not because of the box in which they lived. And that was something that was going to, should that come about, it was going to work for them as well. Okay, differently, because they obviously occupied an extremely different legal and civic status than Black people did, but a society that moved towards some kind of blindness. Okay, because it could be colorblind, or it could be religion blind, or ethnic blind. That was going to be good for them as well. And so the attack on the America that did not judge everybody as individuals, but judge them by again the particular category assigned to them was harmful to them, and they sought to find a way to eradicate or to see the crumbling of those kinds of barriers. Okay, but they couldn't possibly do it just for themselves.
Right. Your book, In the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 through 1935, is a comprehensive survey of 20 years of American Jewish advocacy on behalf of the Black community, and an analysis of the various communal, cultural, and societal motivations behind it. At the time you were working on this book, had there been any previous interest or work on this particular subject?
Right. So by the time I started writing this, there was already a pretty raging discussion about the phenomenon of Black anti-Semitism. And I'm going to use the air quotes, which I think one should never use, and the kind of discussions about the breakdown of the alliance. So I started writing this in 1974-5. So it's already after Ocean Hill-Brownsville, for example, which I put as a kind of watershed moment in the opening up of that conversation. Although, as I show in the book, that it had precedent in earlier periods.
Could you possibly fill that out just a little bit?
Oh, sure. So in the late 1960s, there was it was a very complex story, but a number of school districts in New York City were under a grant from the Ford Foundation made neighborhood control. Okay, they were going to give, this was a kind of New York civil rights kind of project. And the school would be run by people within the neighborhood. And one school in Brooklyn, in Ocean Hill-Brownsville, several Jewish teachers were removed. They were assigned to different schools, and they didn't want to go. This was the school. They were teachers in Ocean Hill-Brownsville. It was a violation of their union contract. And it escalated really quite intensely, and the teachers union under Albert Shanker gets involved, and the rhetoric is heated, and a number of Black community leaders, Sonny Carson was one, and fascinatingly, Julius Lester, who later converts to Judaism, is also a voice in this, and it takes on really strong anti-Semitic tones. There's no question. And so this captures headlines, beyond the New York. Who would have cared about a teacher strike, in a little corner of Brooklyn? But it captured national headlines. And there was so much discussion at the time, the alliance is over. Okay, look what happened in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. The minute there's this clash between the Jewish teachers and the union and the neighborhood controlled schools, the alliance phrase, which then led to article after article, which, well, maybe this alliance was never very strong. Maybe this alliance was kind of built on a house of sand, and the first little blowing of the wind knocked it over. And so when I started writing this, and here you said I wrote this as a scholar, and I surely did. And there's not a word in there that didn't come out of the primary sources. But I realized retrospectively, I don't think I saw it at the time, that what I wanted to do as somebody who'd had my first political activity as a teenager in high school civil rights work, I didn't want the alliance to fray. I wanted to say, no, it wasn't built on kind of nothingness. It wasn't built on a kind of pretty rickety structure. But my gosh, look, it goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, it has a kind of solidity to it. And yes, Ocean Hill, Brownsville happened. And there are all sorts of other episodes in this, again, late 60s, early 70s period that, again, highlighted the issue of, is this going to fall apart? The first discussions about Jewish reactions to affirmative action. Okay, and so I realized what I had in it was my own, I had some skin in the game. And it was, rightly or wrongly, because again, this is a book I wrote a long time ago. It's kind of, I wanted to keep alive that just incredible energy and intensity of my youthful reactions to going to hear Martin Luther King speak, to going to demonstrations with my Jewish youth group, to starting a high school civil rights organization with the NAACP Youth Council. I mean, this was the kind of romance of my youth, and I didn't want that to fall apart. And while I was no longer an activist, I'm now a scholar. I realized what I was trying to do is use my scholarship to justify my own political, but it was more than political. It was really kind of who I was, to justify that whole part of my life.
I find this really interesting. I love the idea that you wanted a communal narrative to continue. So one of your approaches as a scholar to bolstering that, and kind of, I guess, in a way, sort of honoring its space in your life personally, was by finding historical precedents for it, by actually supporting it with things that actually happened. And I'll say from personal experience, this is very different than my interactions personally with the Black Jewish Alliance as a narrative, right? It's always a narrative, but it rarely ever has history backing it up, or a bibliography, or something I could, something that is actively pointed to, where it's like, this is actually, it's just kind of like this legend that is sort of vaguely invoked in conversation. And what I really liked about your book was that it had the facts, and it had numbers, and it had instances, and it had dates, and it had, and this was meant to go this way, and it went that way pretty far. And then in some ways it didn't go as well. And there are like a number of different approaches. It wasn't just this like mass movement, it was rather a bunch of people moving in concert.
Right. I mean, that's really says it so well. I mean, one of my hallmarks, I think, as a researcher is I often go into sort of archival sources or other primary sources, not knowing if I'm going to find anything. And I say, am I going to find something on my topic, something that will carry my evidence, my evidentiary base further? And it was remarkable how every place I turned, swimming in these archives of African American organizations, African American newspapers, Jewish newspapers, English, Yiddish, material coming out of the pretty Americanized, sort of comfortable middle class associated with reform, all the way over to the labor movement. It was just always there. And, so I went to going through the papers of the NAACP and their archives at the Library of Congress, and they had a really big, thick folder called Speakers Bureau. Okay, so somehow it wasn't clear from the material how these are like mimeographed forms had been sent out, and they were asking people, would you be willing to be a speaker in your community for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People? And just one after another, there were these rabbis saying, yes, I'd love to do it. And one of the questions was, what is the topic, or what's the title of the talk you would give? And it was, I stand up for my Negro brother because I understand him. And just again, now clearly they couldn't have possibly really understood, but that's okay. But it was just, okay, I'm going to look in this file folder, and there were my people, there were the subjects of this book.
I shared that particular part of the book with my husband as a rabbi because I was like, look how clever this is. He said, as a rabbi, I have to say I really admire the strategy of of being on a speakers bureau of an organization which if I was a member, it would have been extremely controversial, but I have the ability to actually speak on behalf of this organization, and that's what I can do.
Right. And then, conversely, going through the Yiddish press, okay, and I went through, a whole, 4 or 5 newspapers with very different political orientations. Those newspapers would take such pride in the work of all of these Jewish activists. And so the forward, which was socialist, was writing articles praising Julius Rosenwald, the capitalist who was anti-union. Why? Because he stands up for the Negro, and he gives many of his millions to the Negroes. So somebody who they would have had no love for at all, they would have castigated for his anti-union stance. On this, they liked him.
Even a broken capitalist clock.
Right.
So, the first edition of your book was written in 1977, towards the end of a decade that witnessed the fruition of many of the efforts sown during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, but also a rising political reaction against those gains. The 70s have also been described, both anecdotally and otherwise, as a period of waning cross-ethnic solidarity in the ongoing fight for civil rights. Do these factors inform or have any effect on your book? Do you think that your work in any way interacted directly with these issues as they unfolded?
Well, how they interacted directly, in a way, I can't say. But certainly, as I perceived that period from the latter part of the 70s into the 90s, I realized, again, this is a kind of retrospective, that I still didn't want to give up on this. I still didn't, and that, certainly the 80s, the 90s were just kind of one episode after another, right? One kind of salvo in a conversation about two sides. First, a salvo, a kind of that the alliance just didn't exist any longer. And there are actually a couple books that come out in that period that said the end of the alliance is over, no more alliance, and so on.
This was after you published your book?
After I published mine, but before the second edition
reissue.
came out.
Got it.
Yeah, and also a kind of rhetoric in the Jewish world, which essentially said, okay, we'll put this in a kind of very general way. We did so much for them, and look how they're paying us back. And what struck me was missing is okay, that is, even though I don't write as a Jew, I like to think I don't, but I'm sure I do. But Jews got a lot out of this themselves. And that the activity was never this kind of romantic, utterly altruistic behavior. It was good behavior. It was what, in relationship to the question that you posed at the beginning, what should we do? They did the right thing. Okay, they did the right thing. And I don't know why they had no guides to tell them this was the right thing to do. They kind of staggered into this. They did the right thing, but it was never just to be good. Okay, it was doing good for a range of reasons rather than doing good just to be good. And, certainly in many of these organizations, let's say like the NAACP, just a good example, where there were so many Jews in the launching of the movement, in the issuing of the call, and all of the meetings, on the board of directors, in the staff meetings of the inner circle, officers, the president of the NAACP, and so on. So they're there, and while they're there, they are not only doing good, because this really was, I would almost venture to say, sacred work at that moment in time, but they are also interacting with they're interacting with well-off, well-placed white Americans of non-Jews. And this became a way for them to make an alliance with those people as well. And they were able to, in their service for Black people, and again, I say this, they did it as they understood they could do it. They are also were in the process of dispelling many of the pervasive myths about Jews, which is they're selfish, they only care about themselves, they don't stick out their neck for someone else. Okay, that the goodness of one's heart is a Christian value, not a Jewish value. And so when they're in these, meetings, in these organizations, when they're donating money, and they make a big show of donating the money, they are saying, look, we are not only for ourselves. And I think, again, I was just really moved by Du Bois's obituary in the crisis for Julius Rosenwald. And Du Bois, who again would have differed tremendously with Rosenwald about what the political strategy should be. He said Julius Rosenwald's philanthropy is the greatest indictment of the Christian world.
Wow.
And Du Bois was no kind of religious Christian, but are you saying that the fact, and you see this over and over again, that by doing this work, Louis Marshall, Stephen Wise, and so on and so on, they are saying we serve others at the same time that we serve ourselves. And so I think on some level, the Jewish communal narrative that this was all altruistic actually was a really bad narrative to develop, because not only was it not accurate, but then it sets the Jews up in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, when they begin to diverge. Okay, let's say over issues like affirmative action. Says, for all these years, you said you were doing it just because it was the right thing to do. And now you're only thinking about your own self-interest. And now you're only thinking about what's good for you. What happened? So in a way, the false narrative helped exacerbate really hostile politics in those decades between the two editions of my book. And in a way, I'm kind of saying, tell the truth, the historical truth is not only more interesting than the kind of flat narrative of, hey, we were good and the Bible told us, the prophets told us to do this. But the real narrative is complicated, and we, Blacks, whites, Jews, everybody, we're all complicated, and we act for a variety of motives. And to reduce these figures in the past, as one book written in, I don't know, 70s, Giants of Justice, really these were people who were trying to figure out how to serve the Jews in this critical period. And one way to serve them was to do good.
All right. The same year your book came out, the television adaptation of Alex Haley's Roots aired on American television, followed a little more than a year later by a 4-part television miniseries titled Holocaust. Your book, as a work of academic inquiry, is, of course, situated outside of the context of popular culture, but I'm curious, as a historian, what you think might have inspired that national interest in looking back on history through the lens of ethnicity, as your book does as well.
Okay, that's great. So for one thing, this is a period of time when the discourse in so many segments of the American population was, and I think it's very much inspired by not just the civil rights movement, but inspired by that sort of latter phase of the civil rights movement, sometimes called Black nationalism, where the banner phrase was Black is beautiful. And so in many of the ethnic communities in the United States, there is a kind of saying, wait a minute, we're beautiful too. And, we have a history, and our history has also been one of kind of powerful American forces trying to make us something, trying to take away our culture. Okay. And now we're going to retrieve it. Okay, there's a book by a philosopher named Michael Novak, and it was called The Rise of the Unmeltable Ethnics. And it came out in like 72, 73. And so this is both reactionary, okay, in as much as all these people are saying, we have a story, we have a culture, we had a history that was shaped by pretty oppressive forces in American society, but we triumphed. So there is that, it is a reaction, but I should say, I think there's also something very genuine about it. That's not just a reaction to that, but was also a kind of rise of a third generation of Jews, the grandchildren of the East European immigrants, the grandchildren of the Italian immigrants, the grandchildren, and they, now are in a position they're comfortable, reasonably comfortable, and they have moved to the suburbs. They have achieved a reasonable level of American education and integration. And there is a kind of wistful longing and nostalgia for something that had been part of their lives. It's, by the way, interesting that in that same little time period that saw Roots and saw Holocaust, we also have to add Irving Howe's The World of Our Fathers, that sort of doorstopper, 1976, the journey of the East European Jews to the United States. And it's we had a real history. And it is not the history of white people. It is the history of Jews, just as Richard Gambino has a book about Italians called Blood of My Blood. We had a real history, and it was taken away from us, maybe not violently, as it was taken away from Black people. I mean, obviously, again, Roots is such a powerful example of this, But we have the right to have a history too. And again, you can see it, I think, both, the two sides of it. It's a reaction to Black assertiveness about Black culture, Kwanzaa, kente cloth, but it's also a reaction to what they, I think, legitimately saw. Who am I to say what's legitimate or not? A reaction to what they understood, the price tag that integration had, in a sense, cultural integration had imposed upon them. They're saying, look, it's our time to tell our story, to learn Irish folk dancing again, to stand up for the case of the Irish. It coincides with the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I said, okay, we now have a real cause to stand up for. Okay, Czech communities go wild in 1968 over the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And so, in a way, global events also touched upon this. What staying power it had, that's beyond my scope. But I think your question is really good about the connection between roots and Holocaust. And it's like the story of suffering, but in the end, the story of triumph over adversity.
Right. It's interesting, all of this sort of bumps up against my childhood, in which it was very much expected that if you were asked sort of what your ethnic background was, it was a hyphenated answer. You were a hyphenated American. That was very much an aspect of my childhood. You were expected to know what country you had come from, your people had come from, before they had ended up in suburban Northern California.
Right. And, and in a way, I think that this story, now, obviously we have a generational difference between us, but at that point in time, much of this rhetoric was, we have to know where we came from in this increasingly suburbanized, homogenized America. We should know where we came from too. And again, I do see it as a kind of negative reaction to Black assertiveness. But on the other hand, there's that other part of the story as well.
Right. So in my very last question, I'm going to ask you about your introduction. In the introduction to the 1995 edition of your book, you wrote, "I had no idea how positive a response the book would garner from historians, or how much interest would be expressed in it by general readers concerned with American Jewish history, the history of race in America, and the percolating issue of Jewish-Black relations." So I'm curious if you could give us an idea of what the reception of the book was when you first published it. What were the new ways of looking at history it introduced into the ongoing American conversation on race and ethnicity?
Okay, so that's a really good question. And as you say it, and you had written it out for me as well, I realized there was a little bit of maybe overstatement on my part, in as much as I certainly got some negative reactions from Jewish readers and in Jewish audiences when I would say much of what I said today to you, which is Jews had something to gain from this. And people would always there were always one or two people who would get really angry at me and say, no, we did it because we were good. You're making it seem like we were selfish or self-serving. And so there, I think that I probably overstated the lack of negative reaction, but I think for the most part, because I was trying to say that this, now I'm not sure I would nowadays ever use the word Black Jewish Alliance. I just don't think, or Black Jewish relations, because this was really not what this book dealt with. But it was something I wanted to say was solid, was strong, was something with deep historic roots. And excuse me, I think many of the people in the audience, however they came down on contemporary politics, that is contemporary politics in the late 70s, 80s, however much they didn't like affirmative action, or however much they were concerned about, again, this phenomenon that was labeled Black anti-Semitism, they still wanted to believe of themselves as good. And I think I told them a story that made them feel like, yeah, we weren't just like all the other white people. And now I didn't write this to make them feel good. Okay, that wasn't my goal. Although maybe I wrote it to make myself feel good, but that I was not aware of. I think that as so many of these, again, particularly community audiences, heard it, they heard, yes, we are, if I can use a Hebrew phrase and then I'll translate it, Rahmanim b'nei Rahmanim, we are the merciful children of the merciful. God, how good is that? And
I believe that's from a Goldfaden opera.
Yeah.
Rahmanim b'nei Rahmanim, yes.
Right. So however much in the moment, 1978, 1981, they are really railing against Jesse Jackson, or they can still say, we are Rahmanim b'nei Rahmanim. And I think it made them feel good. Now, in terms of historians, my colleagues in the history profession, while this book came out, particularly the first edition, before the discourse in the profession began to identify what's now called whiteness studies. Okay, that's a later phenomenon. I see that what I did here is that to say somebody might have been phenotypically white. Okay, and there was, by the way, a teeny little bit in the book about Black Jews, and this reporter from the TOG goes to the synagogue in Harlem, and
yes.
It's pretty. And I really wish I could have found more on that. But one article I saw in all these papers, but here were people who were phenotypically white, whose right to naturalization and citizenship was never questioned, who could had behind them the force of white privilege. Doesn't mean they didn't have they weren't discriminated against here or there. I mean, I'm not understating that, but they had the privilege, the benefits of citizenship and the law. And I think that's really important. And yet, when they devised a political strategy, and the people in this book, when they devised a political strategy to enhance their lives in America, to enhance the safety of the group, okay, to defend the group against potential unknown onslaughts, part of one of the arrows in their quiver, one of the tools in their, one of the weapons in their arsenal was standing up for, investing in, and defending Black Americans. Okay, now, I never say this is all Jews, and I don't know if we'll talk about this last time. The question is what I didn't do in the book. But for the people who inhabit this book, this was the strategy they developed. This was the strategy that made sense. And they didn't seek in these modes to be just like all other white people. Okay, and that seems to me really an important statement about the multiple paths that were available to Jews. I mean, my field is American Jewish history, and
right.
That this was this made sense for them, and having recognized that they are coming to the United States for good, they're not going back any place. That this was the wagon that they were going to hitch themselves to, which was American society. There was no going back. There was no place else. It seemed, again, from all these thousands of sources. These, I mean, just I was drowning in paper. Okay, that this was the way to protect themselves by protecting others. This was the way to protect themselves by changing American society to make it a place that would be comfortable for Jews as it would be comfortable or increasingly comfortable for Black people.
All right, I'm looking forward to getting even more into that in our conversation next week. Um, Hasia, I want to thank you so much for speaking with me this evening and to let you and our viewers know that I'm very much looking forward to our conversation next week at the same time and place. Thank you again, Hasia. And
Thank you. The questions I'm gonna, are just so fabulous in terms of revisiting
Thank you.
The old chapter in my life.
It was a wonderful read. I've been talking about it the entire time as soon as I was done with it. It really strikes me as being one of those books where if you hear somebody sort of opining on a subject that's even close to what this book covers, you want to tell them to just maybe you should read this. And then we'll come back to the conversation.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you again, Hasia, and I'll be seeing you next week.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thanks to the audience and to Ann Toback and the Workers' Circle, which I'm honored to be on the board.
It's an honor to have you. On Tuesday, November 16th, from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern, join Workers' Circle in its weekly effort to stop voter suppression with our ongoing event, Phone Banking for Voting Rights, which will continue until the Freedom to Vote Act is passed. On the next day, Wednesday, November 17th, Workers' Circle will take part in a day of civil disobedience at the White House in Washington, D.C., as we call on President Biden to use the full power of his office to get the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act signed into law. Later, the evening of Wednesday, November 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern, I will again join Hasia Diner in delving into the contents of her book, In the Almost Promised Land, with a look at the various kinds and instances of Jewish advocacy on behalf of the Black community that existed between 1915 and 1935, what cultural and societal aspects informed that advocacy, and the implications of that history for us today. For more information on these events and other programs and events happening at the Workers' Circle, please visit us at circle.org. If you've enjoyed this evening's conversation, be in touch and please tell your friends. I'm Anthony Mordechai Tzvi Russell, and this has been the first half of Beyond the Almost Promised Land, a conversation with Hasia Diner. Good night.